Hi guys, I'm going to show you today how to do sort of this airbrush effect that you see on my L and my A. I've started what's called a wash on the U. A wash in watercolor is just a flat, evenly covered area, usually a larger space. We're going to be using regular watercolors for this as well as watercolor pencils. Double check that they do in fact say watercolor on them, or you won't get the same effect that I'm going to demonstrate. Have a selection of brushes. The larger the brush, the larger the shape. You in watercolor oftentimes have to work quickly because sometimes the effects only work if the paper is still wet. So you've got to work before the stuff dries. So I'm going to demonstrate first how to do a wash, which is that large even color on my G, and then I'm going to show you, this U is already dry, but I'm going to demonstrate some effects that you can do sort of to have kind of these glowing edges. So in order to do a wash, you're going to use your palette, and I like to work sort of off in the corner here on the top of the palette to mix the right consistency. The thicker it is, the darker it's going to look. The more water that's involved, the little lighter it's going to appear. I want it to be really nice and light because I can always make it darker. I can't make it lighter, so you can never go backwards. So I'm going to just take a little bit of water and kind of add it to the cake to activate it, and then kind of just mix it up. And I'm going to bring a little bit over here to get a nice watery consistency. I'm then going to take my brush, and it's going to look like I'm invisible painting, but I'm just painting with water. I'm going to take my wet brush, and I'm going to just ghost paint. I'm painting with water inside the G. Notice with my L and my A, I didn't do anything yet with the shadow areas. I'm going to save that for a later tutorial or a later discussion with things you can do there. You can, if you have an idea in mind, attempt something, but I'm leaving mine blank. So I'm only applying the water inside the area that I want color. Watercolor will move where it's wet. So if you accidentally go outside the lines or into your shadow, chances are the watercolor is going to move outside the shape or into the shadow. And if it's dry, it's not going to touch it. It's kind of a funky thing about watercolor. If you don't like working this fast, you can always work in sections. And then I'm going to go through, once it's covered with water, I'm going to take a little bit of yellow, and I'm just going to apply it to the G. And you're working to try to keep an even consistency. You want to try to avoid getting puddles. If you do get puddles or pools of water, here's a little trick that you can do. So what I mean by a puddle or pool of water is like that happens. You can take your brush, wring out the bristles on top of your paper towel, and then you can kind of suck up or vacuum that up so that you have a nice even coverage. And if it dries out because you're working too slowly, you can always just go back and add more water. Don't mind the announcements.
All walkers are now dismissed. All walkers are now dismissed.
So again, this is called a wash. It's an even coating in a large space of watercolor. And in the U, I'm going to demonstrate how I did some of these airbrush effects that you see on my L and my A. And you can choose a brush that makes sense for you. The large flat ones seem to work for me because I have pretty large letters and pretty large spaces to work in. Always good to have a selection of them. So the next thing I'm going to do is demonstrate how to do some of these kind of glowing corners. So if you want it to look like it's bleeding, you want to make sure that you keep everything really nice and wet. So what I'm going to do is dunk my brush. Notice I'm switching to have a brush that has a little bit more of a point on it, so I have a little more control over where it goes. And I'm going to start by kind of wetting over the top here, and I want to work in the corners. So I'm going to wet the top here also. And I'm going to choose a color that's pretty close, or I chose a color that's very close to yellow, and that was orange. And I mixed my own orange over here. You can't see that. I mixed my own orange over here by taking the orange from the cake and adding little bits of yellow to it to kind of make it a little bit more of a yellow-orange so it's less of a jump. And I'm going to take this and I'm just going to dot it in the corners of my U. And you'll see that it spreads to wherever there's water. Now what I'm going to do, because that looks a little bit sloppy, I'm going to come through here and I'm going to wring my brush out. And I'm just going to kind of soak up some of the puddles. So it's going to be a really light orange for right now. But I can go through and I can continually make that darker. I'm going to blend it here a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit more color, a little bit more pigment to here. I want to make this darker. So I'm going to add more orange and a little bit more yellow to make it a denser, less watered down. And again, I'm going to go and I'm just going to touch the corners. Because I kind of want to make it look as if I spray painted a different color on these corners. And another thing you can do to get even more, so you can kind of hopefully see what I'm doing here, to get even more intensity there, I used watercolor pencils, which you can activate either by dunking them directly in water, or you can color and add water to them. I used an orange pencil to kind of just emphasize, hopefully you can see this, I'm going to bring you in a little closer, to emphasize edges. So my paper is already wet, so this is working nicely, but you obviously want to make sure you're working on a wet surface. You can also do something where you color a little bit of it and then add water to it to kind of blur the lines. And I actually went a little overboard. I did one last step and I went in with pink also in the very, very, very corners, just for even added pop. Now you can probably see just in some of my marks some ideas that you might have for ways you want to approach this. You'll see a lot of graffiti artists that do kind of like this sort of effect. We are going to be doing our spray painting, so you will have an added bonus step on top of this, but you can be very creative with how you kind of take on this process. One thing that I would recommend is keeping your colors, unless you'd want to take the risk, but keeping your colors close to each other on the color wheel. I used reds, yellows, and oranges. If you try to do something like red and green, they're across the color wheel from each other, where they meet and blend together, you might find that it starts to kind of turn into a brown. But have fun working with this and experimenting and see what happens.